Awesome. So on this end, again, just a quick introduction on myself. I am Gabriella DeFlorio. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Prelay. As I'll share a little bit more on overall complex deals, that's really what I lived and breathed for many years. Overall, really navigated complex deals back in my days when I was in the trenches with sales and go-to-market leaders, as well as also really now have been able to discover best practices across organizations globally of how to really scale out around complex deals based upon founding Prelay back in 2019. So what we'll be going through today is to how to best execute on these complex deals across the organization. Specifically on this end, I'll be running you through the hows, whys, and overall what you should be digging into within your organization as a revenue leader. What we find oftentimes is that, especially within a complex deal, it's incredibly difficult to really understand what you should be diving into first, as well as also what you should really be prioritizing as time goes on. So what I'll run you through at least is kind of how high level, how to manage and execute on these, as well as also typically who should be involved and how do we start to really drive these forward and scale them out as well as time goes on. So without further ado, very excited again to be going through this. This is something that I kind of do each and every day with large enterprise organizations. So from a high level, just kind of running you through key kind of steps in the process you should be thinking through for managing complex deals and processes is really thinking through what are those processes we have to run through to date. And when we think through processes, it's what are those validation events that have to happen? What are we having to prove out to the buyer that we're really enough throughout this process? So that could be a proof of concept, maybe a trial, maybe that experiential piece around a pilot period. These are all pieces that we inevitably have to prove out to the buyer, whether it's the product, experience, as well as also functionality around the product as well. So with that, really digging into those internal processes that are being run around those, what we find is typically it goes far beyond the CRM of how your team's actually going through this process. So really understanding, are they going through any sort of documentation for this? Is there a standardized process we're running for this? As well as also who's typically involved in this process. I'll share a little bit more on that end. Once you start diving into this process overall and really starting to understand why they're coming into play, a really huge portion of this is kind of the whys. Why are we having to introduce a pilot? Obviously, lots of resources that have to get involved, as well as also from a monetary perspective, as well as also the kind of people resources perspective. From there, what we can really start to understand of when do these validation points have to happen? Why are they happening? Why are we having to spend any sort of resources on these? And how do we start to understand how we should be prioritizing our resources around them as well? But really taking a step back of, once we do take any sort of, time or resources onto these process sets that come into play, that's where we really need to define success. How do we really define success on maybe a trial, maybe that POC, maybe that pilot period, where mountains of people are having to get involved, as well as mountains of people are having to also go through clear deliverables throughout the process. Really defining success will obviously start to increase that overall win rate, as well as also potential close rate that we could be getting down the line. And when we think about success, it's something that we do have to get buy-in across the organization. Multiple people really get involved, as I'll share a little bit more on the next slide. A lot of other people get involved throughout the process, and we really need to ensure throughout that we're able to keep everyone aligned as to what type of success we're driving toward from a value selling perspective. Now, there's obviously a lot of kind of discovery that has to go on with this. Buy-in is mentioned around success, ensuring that the team is able to really be driving these internal processes in the best way possible. But really what comes into play is starting to really map this out. How do we start to get buy-in as to how we best execute these processes? And honestly, these validation points that are incredibly crucial to the closing of this deal. As well as also, how do we start to really map out how these people can be also adjusting the process as well? Because as we all like to think, we can certainly map out and guide the team throughout a process, but every deal, every opportunity, they're all different, right? In the end, we have to be pretty flexible to the buyer or customer and really what their needs are, but also learn from them down the line. So that's also something as a future note of kind of managing these complex processes, being able to take note of actually what's happening in the field. What are they shifting kind of this guidance based upon for these buyers? And how do we find repeatability around that and maybe improvement points that we could be making as well? But certainly, as I've kind of mentioned already, there's a lot of people that have to get involved in this process. And so certainly it's really important to have that buy-in and have the kind of the people process running in parallel here. So really on our end, what we visualize at Prelay, as well as also with all the companies we work with from a complex process perspective, is really involving those experts in the process. So when we think about experts, those are maybe subject matter experts, those SMEs. It's additionally maybe those proposal managers throughout deal desk, solutions engineers, solutions architects, you name it. Plenty of people that are having to hop into these processes that typically have to get looped in for particular deliverables, whether it's solution design work, maybe it's completing that NDA. And it's really hard to understand who is actually hopping in, who's collaborating in Slack with other team members, who is actually getting involved on Microsoft Teams potentially, or any other email threads. So I think that's another discovery piece beyond what are the steps that are happening, but how do we start to really discover how we're executing on really bringing in the right people into the process and when and why. So when I get to that why, that's really a big portion of this. Why are these people necessary in the process? Are we having to bring in product potentially from the other organization? Is there a very pivotal time where they need to be included to really move this deal forward in a fast manner? These are all things that you definitely want to be really considering as you're thinking through these validation processes and really that involve kind of within that complex deal that you're running. And from there, that's really where we find that you need to start to think through those optimal timing pieces. So as mentioned, kind of like when are they being brought in? Why are they being brought in then? Is that kind of really propelling this deal forward or potentially slowing it down by bringing in another person into the mix and maybe too many cooks in the kitchen in a sense? So that's really where we find how can you start to really map out how these people are getting involved. What we think as well, it's really typically sales stages can be quite high level. You maybe have a POC sales stage, as well as also maybe some sales stages around technical validation, or maybe sales stages around negotiation. There's certainly a lot more that's kind of going on and taking place during that period of time. Obviously within Slack, as well as also documentation that you're maybe running through as a project plan. And beyond that, through other systems like DocuSign and anything else as you name it. But really on that end, what we find out is that it's actually great to really think through how are these people getting involved in that specific sales stage? What is the timeline? What is that date specifically? And how do we ensure that they're able to hop in as quickly as possible and have that upfront context of how they can be the most helpful? And so that's really a huge piece around starting to map out that process and really starting to think through how these people should be involved. And that's where we really come into play with capacity around these people. Typically product, maybe solutions engineering, proposal managers, we find oftentimes they're tossed a lot of different requests and multiple different deals as well, that it's really hard for them to keep up with the process. So really understanding what are the other activities they're having to take up on, and how do we ensure that they are able to really focus on these very high priority deals. So really this mapping of the process, mapping of the people in the process is going to be crucial to ensure that these largest deals, which are often the most complex, can be run in the best way possible. And a huge piece of this, which I already mentioned earlier, is buy-in. How do we get buy-in throughout the process? How do we ensure that we are having alignment throughout the process as well, from our SEs to AEs, potentially more proposal managers, deal desk, maybe even legal that's actually hopping into the process? How do we ensure that as we're mapping this out, that there's accountability and that people are actually taking up on the deliverables that are necessary to get this across the line? Because obviously, if these deliverables aren't taken care of in a certain time period, that's where it starts to find deal slippage coming into play, as well as also potentially loss of revenue. We find there is, certainly if you can imagine you're maybe running a POC or you're running any sort of trial period, and they're maybe looking at other competitors or even looking at their pretty competitive status quo, that if you're not really leveling up on speed and accuracy of all the deliverables needed, that's where you find those buyers maybe dropping out of the mix and potentially obviously losing out on that revenue as well. So on that end, really keeping that team aligned around and having that clear buy-in around this process will be crucial to ensure that these complex deals can be executed across organizations successfully. So really defining those responsibilities and expectations will be super important, especially prior to these deals even being kicked off. So by really templatizing a lot of this and really understanding how do we start to bring in the right people into the mix? How do we start to map out things that typically happen in these enterprise deals, potentially commercial deals throughout the process? And a huge portion of kind of what I just mentioned is how do we really drive toward those clear dates and timelines? Because a clear piece of that around accountability and expectations is how do we ensure that we're hitting those internal SLAs? How are we ensuring that maybe legal is responding back within a timely manner, or we have SEs kind of hopping in, ensuring that we're getting this custom solution design work that's coming into play? These are all things that unfortunately there's a lot running in parallel that we really need to keep track of from a timeline perspective and really set that clear as well. And a huge portion of this that I have already mentioned a little bit was really defining success, defining that value. What are we actually driving toward from a value sense for these buyers and customers? What we find there is oftentimes from a rep, then an SE hopping in for a POC, and then you have your proposal managers. It starts to get kind of lost in the mix as to what type of value you're actually driving for this buyer and customer, and why are these activities even important to be running through? And so that's certainly something that we actually help out on a ton there, is ensuring that you can really be aligning throughout the process from AE to SE, AE to proposal management, AE to deal desk, anyone really throughout the process to ensure that you are aligning that value and you're really reminding the buyer and the customer of why they're really spending their time and resources during this process. And a huge piece of this to really corral everyone together is visibility and transparency. What we find time and time again is, especially around these complex deals, there's so many different things that have to happen between two people, three people, another group that's taking care of another deliverable, that typically we find that the visibility is lost because you're maybe in Slack channels potentially, you're potentially in any sort of docs that are only shared with certain people, that you don't get a full grasp if you're just brought into the deal later on and for a quick deliverable, as well as also from a transparency sense, it's hard to really loop back as to what has worked on past kind of deals for looping in particular people into the mix, what questions have been answered. Fortunately, with kind of limited information and kind of more of a silo effect of systems, we find that typically that kind of lacks alignment there. So really being able to bring these in one place, or at least be able to have visibility around this information for anyone that has to get involved on that deal, especially for those validation points, we find that's incredibly crucial to make sure that everyone's able to really be aligned on that value, on those timelines, on their responsibilities and expectations, and really what's happened to date so that they can be as helpful as possible kind of overall throughout the process. So kind of looping back here on these few pieces, really running through managing these complex deal processes, that's a huge portion here of how do we ensure throughout the process we are managing this process at least and taking the buyer through a guided journey. Involving those experts throughout the process as well is a huge portion. How do we align our team that's getting involved internally around this so that we're able to get to that end date as timely as possible, as well as also really hitting that success in the end? And then really keeping, again, that a team aligned is going to be the biggest portion here, because again, a complex deal, an enterprise deal is not driven alone. It is driven with a team. It's driven with a team in mind, ensuring that every person has their own responsibilities and expectations on the deal. So as a reminder, on my end, I'm Gabriella DeFlorio, CEO and co-founder of Prelay. We certainly do drive team selling at Prelay. That's our core platform, as mentioned. So that's something that we have really ensured to help companies around, is how to start to really execute on these complex processes and overall deals with multiple people involved, and really starting to drive that alignment internally so that they can obviously be compounding on revenue for the long term. And you can follow me, and also feel free to ping me on email as well at gabriella@prelay.com, as well as also on Twitter and LinkedIn, and the website as well as prelay.com. But feel free, reach out with any questions. I know it's a kind of a quicker talk, but happy to hop on any sort of call and answer any sort of questions here.